So in this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about texturing and rendering, or rendering to the preview. So at this point inside my scene, I have some real basic geometry. I kind of focused on just laying things out and getting my general references down. But I want a little bit more contrast between the body of the snowman and the eyes. And right now, everything is just defaulting to its, default, this kind of middle gray color. Right now I'm looking at this view as a preview. So this is just kind of a real-time render, really low quality render. And if I want to see what the scene will actually look like, I can do a render to preview. So there's 3 render buttons up here. There's the render settings, and there's the render to picture viewer, and hiding behind render to picture viewer is lots of different options. And over to the left is the render view. And the render view is handy because it'll give us a real quick preview when we click it. This will render our scene and show us what our scene looks like based on what kind of objects we have in it, what kind of environment, what kind of lights and textures. So this is a real render, a final render of our object. I'm pretty unimpressed right now because I don't have any textures and I don't have any lights. But I do get a sense of what my scene looks like. So let me add a few materials to the scene, and it'll help provide some contrast. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll my mouse down to the bottom, and we have this texture manager down here. Inside this big gray empty bar, you can see that there's a little menu system here. And we have the option to create, edit, and do some other things. And all I'm going to do is just double click directly inside this big gray bar, and what that will do is generate a new material. Now, materials are the way that Cinema 4D and in general 3D kind of calculates what an object looks like, and we have a lot of different options on how we can control this material. Now, before I start modifying this material, I want to point out that we can, if I deselect this material, there's nothing in the Attributes Manager. If I single click on the material in the Attributes Manager, it shows me the material properties. If I double click, it shows me the material editor, and I can close that window. Currently, I have a default material. Its name is matte, short for material. I can rename the material either directly in this in the material manager by double clicking on the title. And I can call this Snowman Body, or I can call it Snow, or whatever makes sense. Alternatively, I can double click on the material, and I can highlight its name underneath its preview, and I can rename it whatever I want. Okay, now I'm going to get in the habit. I'll just right click and choose to delete. Somewhere in here is delete. I don't see it. I don't see delete material, so I can select it with the left click and hit the delete key, and it goes away. Let me redo that process. I'm going to double click to create a default material. I'll double click on its name, and I'll call that Snowman Body, and hit return. I'll double click on the material, and this takes me into the material editor. Now, the material editor, there's a lot going on in this space. On the left side, we have all the different channels that are available to this Snowman Body material. Currently, we have the color channel selected. I can tell because it's orange. And to the right, it's active because there's a check mark in it. Underneath color, we have diffusion, which is not active because there's no check mark here. Okay, so it's really important that we understand what we're looking at here. I have the color channel selected. It's telling me it's the color channel here, but if I select on other channels, you can see that I'm showing those options here. Until we get used to the workflow, it's very easy to create a material and select a channel that we're not paying attention, that we're looking at maybe the luminance channel, and we change the color and we don't see the effects of that color happening. Maybe because the channel is, even though we've changed it, is still turned off, or we're just looking at a channel that's not going to really modify the preview look of it. So I want to make sure that color is selected. And then in the color channel, I can come over here to this color swatch, and I can either use these RGB sliders, or I can double click on this color swatch, and this will bring up this color picker. And this allows me to kind of slide around in the brightness and saturation of this color, or I can do the hue slider here, or I can grab this. I'm just going to send this kind of over towards a blue color, and I'll make it very, very white, but with just a little bit of blue in it. And I'll say OK. And when we do that, we can see that that material updates its color. And just to put a finer point on that, if I make that color something dark, it'll change. But I'll just send that back to the color that I want. Okay, so I've adjusted the color. There's a lot of different parameters here that we can play with, but right now I'm just adjusting the color. Now, default materials come with two channels turned on, and that's color and reflectance. And the reflectance is by default turned on, and if we turn it off, you can see that we just kind of lose this. It's really subtle, but we lose this kind of specular highlight. Okay, and if we look in the default specular, that's where we're getting this information over here. For now, I'm just going to let this default. I'm not going to modify it at all. I'll make sure I go back to the color channel, and I'll close this material editor. Now, when I apply materials, I have a couple of different options. I could click and drag and just drop that material onto an object, but that's going to become pretty imprecise when we have more complicated models, or when we have one continuous model and we want different textures applied to different parts of it. So what I'm going to suggest that you do is you click and drag the material and drop it onto the object in the object manager. Okay, so I can click, drag, and drop it onto the middle object. So that'll start to establish a good habit on the front end. Okay, and that gives us an idea of we're being very precise that way. And it'll also give us access to a little bit more information. Now, if I apply a material to an object and I decide that either I want to change that material, I could simply go into the material. I'll double click. I'm going to move this off to the side so you can see the results of this a little bit more clearly. If I change this material color and I say OK, you'll notice that every instance that's using that material gets updated. So I'll change this back to a white. That's because, you know, I applied that material to 3 different objects, and those 3 objects are referencing this one material. Okay, so I'll close that. I'm going to make another material for the eyes. So I'll just double click off in this kind of gray bar off in the workspace. This time I'll rename the material directly in the material manager. So I'll double click. I'm inside the material editor here, and I'll rename this. I'll call this charcoal eye, and I'll click on the color, and I'll bring that down to a nice charcoal. Probably keep it within the blue, just in case if it does pick up a little bit of color. It's very desaturated. It's very dark, but there's just a subtle hint of blue in there, and I'll say OK. In this case, I don't want any reflectance, at least for now I don't. So I'll just uncheck that and turn that off, and that makes it a very kind of flat looking texture. And I'll close that, and I'll drag and drop this onto an eye. Now, when I drag and drop that onto an eye, if I want to get rid of this texture from this object, you'll notice that when I dragged and dropped this material, it inherits a material tag. So I1 does not have a material assigned to it. I can tell because it does not have these material tags. Now, when I assign this charcoal texture, if I click and drag and I drop it onto I1, watch what happens over here when I drop this material. I get a little material tag. This is the reference to the material that's being used. So this object has this material, which is referenced over here. If I want to get rid of that material from this object, I'll just select the material tag. I'll select it, and I'll hit the delete key. You can see that material goes away. I'll just take that and drag and drop that again onto that object, and you can see that it inherits it. Now, it is possible to have multiple materials on an object, but you'll see that if I just borrow this snowman and I drop that onto I, we're creating this kind of stack of materials, and whatever material is kind of furthest off to the right, or the most recent material, is going to be the material that we see until we modify some things. So I'm just going to select that material, and I'll delete it, and I can see that underneath that material was the previous material that I used. Okay, so I have these basic materials. So now, when I choose to render this view, whatever view I'm looking at, if I click render, now I can see that I kind of have this higher contrast scene. Okay, so I got some basic materials going on. It helps to make my object look a little more interesting. But what's really going to start to kind of set this environment off is to have an environment so my snowman isn't floating in space, but also to have some lights inside the scene. So we'll do that in the next presentation. We'll also talk about grouping these objects, because as we start to kind of build our scene and some other assets, we want to start to stay organized. So it's really important that we've named our objects accordingly, and that we can access this information pretty readily. In the next presentation, we'll talk about grouping and managing objects, and we'll talk about the parent-child relationship when it comes to groups in a 3D space. We'll also talk about rendering, but we'll do that in the next presentation.